I'm Rex Cruz and welcome once again to the online course on responding to climate risks in agriculture and natural resource management. We're still covering Module 3, the introductory part of vulnerability assessment. For this particular lecture, I'll deliver the part 1 of the assessment process for climate change vulnerability assessment. If you recall in the previous lecture, I mentioned about the importance of information on vulnerability in adaptation planning, particularly in the design, prioritization, and evaluation of adaptation strategies. For this particular lecture, I'll share with you the different steps involved in undertaking vulnerability assessment. And let me begin with step number 1, definition of scope and purpose of assessment. The main goal of this step is to identify people and areas of interest. In other words, we are not yet saying that these are the people or areas that are vulnerable to climate change, but these are simply the people who are of interest. They may or may not be vulnerable to climate change. The main output of this step are a list of vulnerable areas, likely vulnerable areas, and list of areas that will be potentially affected. The data that we need here at the minimum includes records of past climate change related impacts, base maps, meaning to say location map, vegetation cover map, topographic map, including demographic information and forest cover data. This information we can generate through various means. One of them is by reviewing existing documents, by interviewing key informants, people from government agencies or people from the communities. And we can also engage our stakeholders in focus group discussions. This can involve people who are exposed to climate-related events or people who are in a position to help vulnerable people. In this table, what you can see here is an example of information generated through focus group discussions. Imagine you start with a blank table. The first thing that you do is to engage the participants in the focus group discussion to identify different climate-related events that has occurred in the past, such as, for instance, here, small flood events, other big flood events, and a particular flood event. And then, once they have identified that, you start asking them of specific information that are of relevance, such as the date of occurrence of these climate-related events. For instance, here they identified small flood events that occurred in different years. And they have identified big flood events that occurred in certain months, such as May 8, August 27 of a particular year. And then you also ask them about what are the communities affected. Such as here, they identified different communities that are affected by the different climate events that they have identified. And you can also ask how many people were affected by these different events, such as, for instance, here they have identified 341 families affected by the 2000 flood that occurred in the area. And then you can also ask the people participating in the discussion about the specifics of what actually happened during the time that the flood events occurred, such as, for instance, flooding of the floodplain, damaging the crops, and so on. This is the kind of information that you can generate through focus group discussion. Moving on to step number 2, this is a description of people, areas, and sector that will be affected or likely be affected by climate change. The purpose of this step is to establish baseline conditions and also to assess the non-climate stressors. The importance of this is to be able to segregate the impacts due to climate change and the impact due to some other factors, so that in the design of adaptation measures, we can be very specific and we can be very directed in proposing measures that will truly address the impacts of climate change and not, trying to address something that is not due to climate change. The output here is a list of priority impact areas. The data that we need for this particular step include records of past climate change related impacts, base maps, demographic information, and information on forest cover. And this is if you are conducting a vulnerability assessment for the forestry sector. But then you can include other specific information as may be related to the particular area of interest or groups of people that you are trying to study. In generating this information, again, focus group discussion will be very useful, participatory workshops, and historical analysis or reconstruction of past events. Step number 3, which is the assessment of exposure to climate change. The purpose of this step is to assess the past and future climate-related hazards and risks. The main output of this step are actually future climate scenarios at different time periods. In this case, it's 2020, 2050, and 2080, which is the commonly used time slices for assessing vulnerability assessment. What you can see on the screen now are maps of mean annual temperature increases in the Philippines in 2020 and 2050. These maps were developed by the Weather Service Agency of the Philippines, and they downscaled this information from the global climate scenarios, and these are readily available, and people can actually request from the weather agency these kinds of information. I'm very sure it's true in other countries. These information are free whenever available. Universities and research institutions some of them are also developing these kinds of information, and I'm sure they can also access from these data sources. Likewise, for rainfall, we can also get rainfall exposure maps and information from various sources, but more specifically in this particular example, what we can see here are weather agency generated information. This is in the Philippines for the